We're in the middle of the first part. Remember, the laws is divided into 3 parts. The first part is the prologue. And the prologue is basically setting up the symposium of the city, the paradigm of the harmonious city. And we're going through all the different parts of the city. The last part we dealt with last week was the place of the city. The 3 parts today are going to be the prime matter of the city, the time of the city, and the constitutional form of the city. And I have to admit that, at least for me personally, after reading all of the dialogues of Plato, to me the laws makes all the sense in the world. Right? There's something very, at least for me, there's something very comprehensible about it. Because there is so much that I think is just a mature reflection and a mature statement on Plato's behalf of philosophy. It's a mature statement of philosophy. So, the prime matter of the city, that's from 705 to 709. The prime matter of the city, basically, the first discussion here is about, it's a veiled discussion of the growth of the Athenian Empire. Right? The first thing that the city has to be concerned about is growth. And what is the right way to grow? And the subtle critique, I think, of this part is that a city should not grow in an empire-like way. That if a city is growing in an empire-like way, there's something wrong with it. In the second part of this section, he deals with the relationship between the military and the city, the military and the culture. And the basic point here is that the way the society fights is a reflection of its military and vice versa. The way a society is organized is also a reflection of its military. And Socrates identifies here one of the fundamental features of the Western way of life and the Western way of war. Westerners tend to like man-to-man, infantry-to-infantry, face-to-face combat. We pride ourselves in political life as being up front. Eventually, you have a court case where one side competes against the other side, or you have an election. The election is the contest. Or you have a war, right? The ultimate way wars are decided, in the West anyway, traditionally, is that you have 2 sets of infantry that clash against each other. And no war is brought to a definitive end until one set of infantry definitively defeats the set of infantry of another army in Western way of war. And you'll notice that never happened in Iraq. We contrast this with Eastern way of war. The tendency for the Easterners tends to be, if you can surprise your enemy with an attack that he's not aware of, or that will cause terror in his society, then your enemy will capitulate. That's the way Japan took over China in the Second World War. They did a series of Pearl Harbors. And they caused terror in the Chinese population, and China capitulated. That didn't work against the U.S. Why? Because that kind of an attack against a Western country, traditionally, tends to make the Western country want to seek out a man-to-man, infantry-to-infantry battle. And that infantry-to-infantry battle could be on land or on sea. A classic example of a sea battle would be Lepanto, or Salamis, right? A classical land battle along these lines would be Poitiers, the Battle of Poitiers, Charles Martel versus the Arabs, or most of the major battles of World War II were of this kind, infantry to infantry clashes. In the end, though, Plato takes on Hobbes. He asks the question, what is the city for? And ultimately he's going to say, look, the city is not just for preservation. This isn't Survivor. Right? This is not Survivor. Survivor is an erroneous understanding of the city. Survivor is a Hobbesian. The TV show Survivor is a Hobbesian understanding of the city. It's not Platonic at all. Because the purpose of it is just to preserve yourself. It's not to live virtue. Right?
What's funny about that too, though, is that I watched the first season of it. And it was that first group of people who defined every season from them.
Yeah.
Because there was never anything in the rules of the game that you had to allow yourself to be in a certain way, you had to behave a certain way, or work around people's back, but then everybody else watches that and that becomes the archetype of the way it behaves.
Right.
Which is what Plato's talking about. He's saying, hey, if you're susceptible to this kind of monkey see, monkey do behavior, you have no business forming or leading a city.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it's funny, there's some article that came out recently about how there's a part of the brain, they've traced it to the part of the brain that deals with social behavior. The passions for social behavior, like dogs and monkeys have the same sort of thing. And they've traced it in the human brain. And obviously then, the human intellect is just another evolutionary adaptation for survival, for cooperation. We
Right.
figured out not only is that true, but it's also a material presence in the brain, right?
It's even better.
Yeah, exactly. It's even better. It's outrageous.
One of the most important things to have in society is unity. And actually, he advocates a kind of multicultural society. He says if you have any group in your society that's too radical, you should send them to start their own society. That's kind of what England did with the Puritans. Right? They were too radical, so they got kicked out. He says, this is at 708 BD, the best society would allow for some mixture of cultures. And the U.S., before the First World War, was a kind of pragmatic federalism that mixed together in a harmonious way the various ethnic groups. And then he starts to, it's interesting, at this point he also says, part of the matter of society is divine providence. Right? That there are these professions like pilots, doctors, generals. The statesmen, these are disciplines which imitate God in the way God governs the universe. The statesman is a kind of divine doctor or a divine pilot. Pilot here is like the pilot of a ship, of a sea ship, not an airship. So the statesman is like the doctor of society. And so ultimately, just like the doctor is trying to discover the truth to help his patient, or a pilot is trying to discover the truth about the sea so he can get the boat to shore, so too a statesman is trying to discover the truth about society so that he can lead the society to happiness.
It's something they talk about in book 2, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of things are repeated and built upon in the laws. This leads us to the next part, which is the time of the city. And ironically, the first thing that the statesman should do is pray. I don't think it's ironic, actually. It might be strange for us moderns who are prejudiced by Nietzschean and Cartesian philosophy to think that prayer is irrational. But the first thing a statesman should do is pray. And prayer is communion with the divine. And we'll come back to this in a while. Next, the statesman should seek moderation. And again, in the end, he's going to tell us that moderation is a kind of measure. It's a measure of action in relation to the divine. So moderation is not the typical freshman guy. Like I always have students that come up to me and say, my motto in life is moderation. Right? Well, the typical guy that says that is a shark. Right? Because basically what he's saying is, I'm going to have a little bit of pleasure and a little bit of money and a little bit of power and a little bit of comfort, and I'm never going to live virtue. Right? I'm going to be a little bit corrupt in all possible ways. And I won't be that bad of a guy. But that's not what moderation is.
I only get drunk on Friday and Saturday nights.
Yeah, that's shark moderation. Right? No, the true measure of moderation is God. Is the divine. So it's not good enough to say, well, I'm not like the other people. Right? If you're really interested in living virtue, the standard by which you judge yourself is the divine, is Jesus Christ. That will not, actually, and I found out today, that will get a number of students very upset at you, just to say that, yeah.
Kids aren't taught catechism anymore, so you say things semi-religious.
I'm so happy. I read a French phenomenologist a couple weeks ago who said there's no distinction between philosophy and theology. So he wrote an introduction to philosophy book on the liturgy. So today in class I was talking about the Eucharist, and someone said, is this philosophy or theology we're dealing with? And I said, oh, as this French phenomenologist Jacques Chrétien said, there's really no distinction. And then, it was accepted by everybody at that point. Because if it's phenomenologist, right, everyone will accept it. So that kind of stuff will get you tenure.
Well, there is a distinction, just not a separation, right?
Yeah, one thing
they're distinguishable but not separate. Academic Trojan horse. Yeah, academic Trojan horse.
Actually, in some ways, phenomenology would be a great academic Trojan horse right now. Because of the French phenomenologists. Because the Catholics has basically taken over French phenomenology. And if you like phenomenology as a method, if you're willing, if you can handle it, you can study with someone like Jean-Luc Marion at Chicago.
See, no.
He's in Chicago half the year.
I have serious problems with him.
Well, fine. I'm just saying.
That whole God is love before he's being sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
I don't like that.
Well, the thing is, though...
Have you read that essay competition, by the way?
No.
Anyway, let's go on.
You read a good essay for that.
God is
So the time of the city.
The Deus Caritas thing.
The time of the city is moderation. And then also in this part of the time of the city, he starts to go into the difference between a tyrant, a monarch, a democrat, and an oligarch. And he ranks the regimes, right? The worst kind of regime is the tyranny. The second worst kind of regime is oligarchy. Right? Did you pick up on that?
Yeah.
Right? The worst regime, well, anarchy would be worse than... Basically, anarchy is tyranny.
It's individual tyranny, right?
Yeah.
It's not even in it.
Because, in anarchy, though, everybody becomes an idiot. Literally, the term idiot is the term for the radical individualist. Someone who thought he could live outside of society is an idiot. That's what idiotas comes from. The tyrant is the one who uses complete violence. The tyrant is the one who uses complete violence to impose his way of life on the city. De Tocqueville's fear was that because of the Enlightenment, modern societies could become like tyrannies without the tyrant. Right? That people would on their own live as if of their own choice. They would live isolated lives as if they were living in tyrannical societies.
Democracy in America.
Yeah. Well, no, it's fascinating to go to an ex-Soviet country and to realize that they have many of the same behaviors as we do in the United States. Like the Soviets implemented this policy of moving populations around the Soviet Union so that no group could unite against the government. We Americans freely choose to do that. And it has the same social effects as far as breaking down the family, causing divorce, all this other kind of stuff. They implemented contraception as a mandatory policy. We have chosen to accept it. Divorce the same way. Abortion the same way. Everything that the communists legislated de facto, we have chosen as part of the cultural wars of the 20th century. I mean, so that's kind of an interesting thing to reflect on, without becoming pessimistic. Question?
Can you go on with the ordering of the regimes?
Yeah, so oligarchy is worse than tyranny. Why? Because oligarchy is a way by which money rules in a society.
Worse than tyranny?
Yes. No, oligarchy is second worst after tyranny.
After tyranny, yeah.
But monarchy and democracy are better than oligarchy.
Isn't that different than what he had in the Republic, though?
Yeah, democracy's like behind tyranny.
Democracy...
Well, no, democracy leads to tyranny.
Yeah, oligarchy leads to democracy in the Republic, though. Democracy is the second worst in the Republic.
But again, you got to remember, the Republic is specifically looking at the order of the soul, not the regime.
So there's a difference here that needs zero in.
Now we're talking about the political regime. In Book 8 of the Republic, we're ultimately talking about the soul. Now we're talking about the regime.
So what's the difference then? Why do they flip? Why is there an inversion?
I would say in the end, well, one of the things he says about Athens later on in the discussion is that Athens is a democracy, but it's really an aristocracy. That there really is no pure monarchy or pure democracy. There's always a blend of the other constitutional forms mixed into it, which basically moderates its bad tendencies.
That's what we're supposed to have, right?
Yeah. We'll get into that more in a second. So in the best regime, no matter what institutional form you have, you might have to rely on prophets to do this, he says. Right? But you will have a mixture. Basically, there will be a harmonic convergence between power, prudence, and moderation. This is something important to remember about Plato. Plato is not a Pollyanna type thinker. Right? He's not saying it. Sometimes I think we tend to think anybody that exercises power is bad. What Plato would say is that the political society should not be based on power, but you have to use power at some point. Right? You have to use police force at some point. You have to have a military to defend your way of life. The problem is that these things should not lead. In a tyrannical society, these things lead. And they take a kind of priority over every other decision. And also in an unjust society, you might say there's this I think I mentioned this before. There's a sociologist named Ann Hendershot at the University of San Diego. She just wrote a book on deviancy. And she basically figures out something in her book that every society has 10% deviance. So the question is whether your society gets the right 10% in the deviant category. If your society gets the wrong 10% in the deviant category, then the real deviants will end up ruling. Or they'll be given rewards that they shouldn't be given. Right? And so what she points out about America, again, not to be, she basically says that the problem with America is that we're making Catholics into the deviants.
pretty standard for America.
Yeah.
Are you sure she wasn't doing a case study on Notre Dame's faculty senate?
Well, no, actually, precisely, she looks at the universities as the example.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because, again, she understands the Platonic point that it's the universities over time that set the path for society. So she basically points out that what happened in the old time, in the bad old days in the U.S. is that Catholics were not exactly the deviants, but they weren't in positions of power either, and they had more or less the right people in the deviant category. But now that's not true anymore. That the deviants are in the universities. And ultimately, again, what Plato will get to later on, the first thing you've got to get right in society is marriage and education. If you get that wrong, that's bad news for the history of the society, or for the future of the society. So, from 709 to 712 is the time of the city. From 712 to 715 is the form of the city. This is where he ends up saying, basically he says, Sparta in Greece is commonly referred to as the ideal society, but in the end he says Sparta is a tyranny. It's not an aristocracy, it's a tyranny. And he says Athens is known as a democracy, but it's really not a democracy, it's really an aristocracy. Because there are all these aristocratic aspects that blend in with the democracy. And also Sparta was really very tight. I mean, Sparta had 4,000 citizens and 10,000 slaves, called the Helots. And the Helots were treated brutally by the Spartans. Brutally. Sparta was not the birthplace of democracy. Despite my aunt-in-law, no, my step-aunt, I forget all the relationships in my family.
You wouldn't have an aunt-in-law.
I could have an aunt-in-law.
You're not married.
If she were married to my uncle, right? But my step-aunt said, my step-aunt saw the 300, and she thought that someone in the 300 said that Sparta was the birthplace of democracy.
It was really outrageous.
But I thought that's just completely wrong.
Well,
Sparta is
professional wrestling.
that's what the look it. Listen. But hang on a second. The French revolutionaries thought that Sparta was the birthplace of democracy. And they were a bunch of idiots, right?
Literally.
Yeah. They were, in both senses of the term, they were idiots, the revolutionaries. So, Sparta was not the birthplace of democracy. Oh yeah, the 300? It's perfect timing for the Iran war.
I know. It's definitely pro-war rhetoric. It was crazy.
I mean, and they made it come out 2 weeks before they did the staged Iranian invasion and taking of 15 British prisoners.
You got a stage?
Oh yeah, it's classic.
It really was crazy, and the fact that they were like, when she goes before the council, it's like, hey, when did we end up in the Roman Senate? Like it was really.
Yeah, well, Sparta did have a kind of council of elders,
but the way it looked,
but it wasn't
the way
a Senate.
It was represented was like as a democracy or something.
Was it in a nice building?
Yeah, it was in a
That's
nice
false because
Roman architecture.
Because Sparta was just a bunch of huts.
Yeah.
It was just there's no architecture from Sparta.
And all sorts of awesome architecture and stuff there. And the other thing was the Spartans were making fun in several points. They were making fun of the Athenians for being homosexual, being boy lovers. And I was just like, are you kidding?
The Spartans were worse than the Athenians.
Didn't they have to legislate marriage?
Yeah.
So that they actually reproduce.
Yeah, and they would
legislate marriage. You can't do that. That's not freedom.
Of course.
By the way, one of the biggest dangers, he says, of a society is the society of an administration by despots. In other words, where you have bureaucrats that just implement laws that are unjust for the people to obey. Right? Because they don't lead the people to virtue. And then he says, Then in this section also, he goes into the origin of disorder in cities. And he basically gives an original sin story. First there was Kronos. Then there were people who were prideful and they rebelled against Kronos. This led to civil strife. This led to power struggle in society. This is from 712 to 715. This led to civil strife, power struggles in society. It led to the birth of social contract philosophy, which is a form of unjust philosophy, an unjust way of conceiving of society. It led to money as the basis for establishing power in the city. And the only way to, and by the end of this section, he basically says the only way to overcome this mentality is by establishing a sense of the common good. Right? That there is a way by which we can understand what is good for each of the separate parts or each of the separate individuals and institutions of a city and how to harmonize them all. So, in other words, I think at this point everything I've said in some way is a summary that's building on things that we've discussed in other dialogues. Is that right or is that wrong? I think that's right.
My one thing is I would like to read the Republic alongside the Laws again to see how that fits in.
Right.
Because I have a feeling there'd be a lot of subtle things
that
you'd have to reread both to pick up on. But yeah, like
we could do that in directed readings.
Peloponnesian War, the Republic,
and the Laws. We could do that in a year. We could take a year and do that. That'd be great, wouldn't it?
That would be excellent.
That's what I'm curious.
Go through all the speeches of Pericles. It's amazing, those speeches, how you're just like, this is ridiculous.
We could do that because
Plato
we would divide the year into 3 parts. So there's 14 semesters. There's 14 weeks in each semester. So that's 28 weeks. So we do the Peloponnesian War in 9 weeks. We take 9 weeks for the Peloponnesian War, 9 weeks for the Republic, and 9 weeks for the Laws.
Now, wouldn't we have to supplement the Peloponnesian War, though, because it's not finished, right? We want to get another history to...
It'd be very easy to supplement it. You could supplement it while lecturing on it.
Oh, okay.
I've taught it before. That'd be a great class. That'd be so much fun.
Teach that as your intro. You could do it in one semester.
You could do that in one semester, yeah. Yeah, you could do that in one semester.
Peloponnesian War is pretty... Especially if everyone involved has already read the Republic and the Law.
Yeah.
What would we call that? There's revolution and then there's...
We'd call that the common good. Right? Empire and the common good. The next section goes from 715 to 735. And in that overall section, he's revealing to us, he's giving us the preamble to the city. Right? He's giving us actually towards the end of this section he says the preamble to the Laws, it's like the intro, it's like the first part of a song. You know how every song has like a little bit of even rock and roll songs do this, right? They have like 5 bars or something like that that's like the intro to the song. I mean, I don't know, like da 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 da, right? That's the preamble. And then it goes right? I don't even know what song it is, but right? But it's something like. But that's the point. In other words, you have this kind of intro, and then you start with the melody. And so the preamble to this section we're going into, it's now the preamble of the Laws. And we can break this, in the notes, we break it into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts. The first part is the beginning of the preamble is our speech to the gods. This is where he says that the highest standard of the city is justice, and that the measure of justice ultimately is God. And the point here, if you were almost to take you could almost take the terms that he uses and you could replace them with Christian terms and you would have the understanding of the common good. Right? First you have God. God is the highest being and he is the measure of all things. God is the measure of how to act poorly and how to act well. After that, you have the angels and the saints, and then your parents. Right? And all of these things should be ordered to God, which is the highest measure of things. That's basically what he says in this section. So the preamble to any city is that the city be properly ordered with respect to the divine. This is the origin of Augustine's The City of God. In the next section, from 718 to 724, he says why preludes are important. Right? Ultimately, law, there are two ways. He's almost describing why social society or why civil life is so important in a country. Right? In other words, things that are outside of the laws. Education, universities, Hollywood, just public life in general. It's not controlled by the government. This is important because ultimately there are two ways you can persuade people to abide by the laws. One way is by persuasion. The other way is by punishment. And the best way to persuade people, obviously, is by persuasion. Remember, the one who uses pure punishment to persuade people is the tyrant. The one who is just will use the proper combination of moderation, punishment, and prudence in order to bring people to the good. This is a teacher does this in the classroom by providing small punishments and rewards in a situation where the stakes are not that high. Ultimately, the first thing that the laws should do is they should persuade the citizens to live virtue. This is not shocking at this point. At least it shouldn't be, right? That the highest thing a person can do is tame his soul. This should also not be as shocking. I mean, he says this in more ways than I'm saying it here. But I think, this is the argument he's given, basically. Right? He gives the famous, he refers to it, the passage in Hesiod here, or Hesiod, the two roads. Did you pick up on that?
Is that worth reading Words and Days?
Only if you read it as part of a class. Or if you're reading something and you go back and start looking at it to help you understand what you're reading. But I wouldn't just read it to read it. So you notice that 718E to 719A, basically what he's talking about here is, at least I give this image sometimes in my intro course. A guy has a dream and he sees two roads before him. One is the road of vice. It's an easy road, it's wide. People are going up it individually. Lots of sunshine, very comfortable. But that road leads to a precipice. Right? The other road is the road of virtue. That road is narrow, jagged path. You got to help each other on the way up it. Very rocky. And that road leads to heaven. Right? Well, that image comes from Hesiod, his Works and Days. And that's what he's referring to here. What's so funny?
I'm sorry. Over spring break, I went to Colorado to the Holy Cross Ambition. And there's two paths to go up the mountain. One of which is rough and obscure, the other which most of the time is clear. Where the clear one was blocked by snow, and everybody who took the clear path couldn't get up to the other one.
There you go.
But Chris Ochoa and I took the path where we actually had to leave the trail to go up.
Because you took my class.
So you took your class. and we made it up to the overlook. We trekked through snow and through an obscure path. We made it to this beautiful ridge where you can see all the Rocky Mountains.
There you go.
You need to learn a lesson.
There you go. Yeah, that's a great example.
So that was like the perfect parallel.
Awesome. Well, you're living the laws.
Am I?
Yes.
Hooray.
You were living the laws.
I don't have to read it anymore, right?
Well, he says later on, the most important thing is to live the virtues, not to talk about them.
Boss Smith.
I don't know. I still may need some help.
No, it is virtuous. It is virtuous to
to.
come to class, right? And actually, this is where he starts to talk about poetry again. Ultimately, poetry, and we all know what poetry means, hopefully, by this point, right? But poetry ultimately is a kind of, it should be a kind of measure of virtue. And the best poets will be poets who can tell good stories that teach us to respect the right things in the right way. And the first thing that poets should be expected to teach us about are the basic harmony of society, the social good, and then marriage and birth. Right? So poetry should get sexual morality right. If it gets it wrong, the society is in trouble.
What would be an example of getting it right?
An example of getting it right? Dante, Tolkien.
That's it.
Maybe Shakespeare.
What? Okay, I don't know anything about these poets, so I'm just gonna say them. Don't know. John Milton? No.
And
Really? What about
adulterer and divorcee.
What about John Donne?
I don't. Maybe John Donne. He was a little bit infected with romanticism, so I think you got to be careful.
Gotta be careful.
Anybody can get something right once in a while, right? Anybody can write some lines that get you in the right direction. But overall, you got to be careful, like, for example, of Milton, because he got divorced. So, and a lot of his poetry is going to justify divorce. He's going to get marriage wrong. I remember because there was a famous English scholar, Stanley Fish. When Stanley Fish came to Notre Dame a couple years ago, he's this famous guy. He's the father of deconstructionism, right? Well, he ran off as a graduate student way back when. So when he came to Notre Dame, his whole talk was how, in the end, morality is determined by the intentions only. And he specifically went to all the scenes in Milton he could go to justify divorce, which is what he did. It's what he and Milton did.
So what specifically is deconstructionism?
Deconstructionism is the rage right now in literary studies. It basically says words have no meaning, so it's the deconstructionist critic who determines the meaning of all things. And the purpose of literary studies is to basically break down all the people that over time have tried to impose their meaning on the text.
So it's rereading everything without historical reference.
Basically, I remember I had a deconstructionist in my first literature class in college. He basically says, Walk for Hospice, that's poetry. That shirt over there on the wall, and you could write you should be able to write a 13-page paper on how that's poetry.
So modern art.
Because that can mean anything. Yeah, it's a kind of form of modern art. But it's infected all of literary studies. You can't get away from it in literary studies right now. ultimately, I think in the end, it's a kind of it's basically Foucault is a deconstructionist. In the end of his life, he says, well, boys, in the end, let's admit it, it's all just power anyway. Right? We haven't gotten past Hobbes. Deconstructionism is just a mask for taking power away from the rationalists and claiming it for ourselves. But most deconstructionists won't admit that.
Did I hit your foot by accident?
Pardon?
Is that your foot or your foot? Sorry.
It wasn't my foot.
You gave me a look and I was like, oh, I'm sorry.
Next section, 726 to 728, is the soul of man. In every soul, there is a master and slave relationship. And ultimately, either the reason will be the master or the passions will be the master within the individual soul. Pardon?
Charioteer speech.
Yeah. Ultimately, the soul that the society should honor is a soul that uses words and deeds to honor virtue. Right? So you should not only respect virtue and respect what virtue requires, but you should do it. And the person who does this the most in the history of the world after Christ is Our Lady. I gotta say that because today's one of her feast days. Right?
Of course, St. Joseph became
St. Joseph, then after Our Lady, he's doing all right too. Yeah. Right? So, but ultimately, we should be happy. Ultimately, we should realize on some level that it's our society. I mean, ultimately, on some level, we should realize that it's society. Again, it's because of pride. Even using Plato, it's because of pride, disordered mental emotions, disordered passions, that we tend to make bad choices, and that those around us, perhaps without knowing it, make bad choices. Why? Because their mental emotions are disordered, and so are ours. And so it's going to cost us a lot of times to do the right thing, right? To do what conforms with virtue. I was listening to Catholic radio on the way up to Michigan last Thursday, and this guy was talking. His last name is Wood, and his daughter has a show on Catholic radio. She sounds like she's 18, but she has a show on Catholic radio, and she interviews her dad. And they're talking about youth ministry and also courtship and marriage. The guy came to Notre Dame, he said, last year on the radio show to talk about courtship and marriage. And he gave out some pamphlet on the ABCs of...
Something Wood?
Yeah.
Christopher Wood? No.
I never heard the guy's
Stephen
first name.
Wood.
Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah. Because they got ABCs of finding a good wife and ABCs of finding a good husband.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like this guy.
Yeah.
This guy said on the show, the problem with the show is that he didn't say enough who he was, and he didn't refer to enough of the titles he was talking about. But this guy was saying after 30 years of doing youth ministry, he started reading St. John Chrysostom. And after 30 years of doing youth ministry, he's realized that and then reading Chrysostom, he realized Chrysostom is right. Right? And he said all these things. I was going, yes, finally, awesome. Somebody other than me is saying it. And the actual book he recommends for people to read is some book written by a guy named O'Brien. But he never said the guy's first name or the title of the book, at least while I was listening to it. Because I turned on in the middle of the program. But apparently this guy O'Brien, he says, gets everything right. And I don't remember. But like one of the things he was saying, which I think is good. Well, there were several things I thought was good. One, in the end, he thought the best policy for physical affection before marriage is zero tolerance, like none. And I thought this was very good. And the reason he gave for it is what I know through, giving a lot of spiritual direction myself. Is that in general, the reason for zero tolerance is because of the weakness of guys. Because guys do not have the willpower to draw the line. Girls do, but guys don't. Right? So the danger always is that guys get in situations where they're going to go worse than they should. Basically, any little thing sets a guy off. So his basic thing was zero tolerance before marriage. And that's what I think. I think that's true. And he says Chrysostom was backing him up on that one. So anyway.
But even within marriage, many times the guy has to have some control.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, right.
But like they have to be habits that are formed. It's not
Right.
like
So no, that's the point. The point is by renouncing it, everything before marriage is like warm up. It's like stretching your muscles before exercising, you know. Or it's like practicing before the game, right? That you have to set habits before marriage, so that when you're in marriage, you know how to live self-sacrifice, basically. You have to have those habits before you get married. And before marriage is the one time you're going to get a chance to set those habits before things get really complicated. So I was celebrating in the car.
I hope one hand was on the wheel.
No, I drove with my knees.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Finally, one other person.
You drive by on the highway, he's doing this, little fist bumps in the car.
Yeah. And I don't even listen to Catholic radio that much. I just happened to flick it on. I was looking for the basketball game. And this flicked on. So, anyway, I don't know. So, anyway. And then he goes into this thing of true fortitude. And again, this should not be a surprise at this point. Right? But true fortitude is overcoming what could be a disordered view of pain or pleasure that would prevent you from doing what is good. So the truly courageous man, he feels pleasure and pain at the right things. He runs away from evils. Things that are truly evil, he runs away from them. Things that are good, he runs towards them. Right? The man who is the coward is the man who knows that there's something that is not good for him, and he still does it. That's the true lack of fortitude. So fortitude is not the soldier who takes a bullet in battle, necessarily. Right? The man of true manliness, of true maturity, is the guy who is able to recognize what is an evil or a potential evil, and basically is able to stay away from it like the plague. I was talking with David O'Connor this morning. He's always great to talk to.
I almost came in and interrupted you guys.
And he basically says, you know what I've realized after all these years of study and teaching? Basically, every slippery slope that the church defines as a slippery slope is in fact a slippery slope. Right?
I can hear him saying
Yeah,
this
he
right
says
now.
it just like that.
He says if you look at it, when the church said in the Protestant Reformation that within 3 generations you'd have a bunch of atheists, the church, because if you denounce authority, you're going to end up in atheism, the church got it right. Just look at the history of any family where some of the children left the Catholic faith. Their grandchildren are all atheists. Right? They hit rock bottom and then they have to start over again. When the Pope in Humanae Vitae, I'm just quoting David O'Connor now, right? When the Pope in Humanae Vitae, when he basically said that, that if you allow for contraception, you'll get divorce, you'll get cohabitation, you'll get adultery. The only thing the Pope got wrong was how fast it's going to happen. It happened by the middle of the 70s, you already had all these problems. And basically we've had a leveling off since the middle 70s. But basically the church got that slippery slope right. Same thing with marriage. Once you get married, you got to renounce friendships with the opposite sex. If you don't, you're on the slippery slope to adultery. You know?
Wait, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Unqualifiedly.
Yes. Look, if you're married, you can't go out to lunch.
Oh, well, that's different. I'm talking about, like, you gotta have a, like, at work
You
and
can-
stuff, you have to be...
Yes, you can be friendly with people at work, but you can't take the secretary and say, "Hey, honey, let's go out to lunch."
Okay, yeah, of course.
Right?
Of course.
But that's
Of
what
course,
friends
of
would
course.
do.
But as a couple, you can have couples that are friends.
Yeah,
and
you
be friends
as
with-
couples.
Yeah.
But not individually.
Yeah, okay. But you can be friendly with people. And
Right. And even then,
as
you got to
couples,
be
it's healthy to be friends with other
Oh,
couples.
very healthy. But even there, you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. So there is a qualification.
Yeah.
It's
well,
only
like,
the one-on-one.
yeah.
Okay, I got you. I thought you were making a radical claim.
Well, if you want me to, I will. If that would help.
Zero tolerance.
Yeah, that was a radical claim. Not really, but, shouldn't surprise me.
Well, this was the standard approach to courtship and marriage until the 60s. And my basic attitude of these days is any cultural norm we developed in the 60s, we should treat it like the bubonic plague.
Yeah.
Because the 60 generations basically has destroyed every good custom that we have developed in Western civilization. Right? Or any potential good thing in our society, they're destroying it. It's a wicked and perverse generation, just as St. Paul said. Right?
The people of the 60s are a wicked and
St. Paul says that. He says, I mean, even
about the 60s.
specifically about the 90s.
no, he says, pray, right? Pray that you may remain as spiritual children in what has become a wicked and perverse generation. And I think you could buy there's a thing we do in the church can do things by appropriation, right? It can apply certain passages of Scripture by appropriation to Our Lady, even though that might not literally apply, it does by appropriation apply. Even crime rates, right? The normal thing for crime rates is that 18 to 28 years old, crime rates go up. But usually when you're 28 or so, crime rates go back down. And then you mature as people and you grow out of your adolescent criminality, especially for males. And you become good citizens. Well, the crime rates for the 60 generation, my generation's crime rates are lower than the crime rates right now for the 60s generation. Right? Even their crime rates have not gone down yet.
Embezzling and all this sort of garbage.
No, but even violent
Really?
crimes. Oh yeah. Because they have not renounced, their drug use has not gone down, their alcoholic abuse has not gone down, and they are not seeking the normal ways of overcoming these things. It's a wicked and perverse, and when I say wicked and perverse, I don't mean that in a snide or I mean that in a sociological sense. It's a corrupt generation. I mean that in an objective scientific
It's a
sense.
good idea. I could do my dissertation on the sociology of the 1960s. Do my
Yeah.
research there.
But then if you're going to do that, you need a very intense spiritual life. No, you do.
The human mind is susceptible to truth in all things.
Right? So, true fortitude. Oh, he says one of the worst, this is another feature of the 60 generation, right? One of the worst things you can do is to start to be someone that does harmful or unjust things, but then blame the institutions for it, and not yourself. Right, that's another feature of the 60s generation. It's also dishonorable to simply present yourself as a survivor, which is another song from the 70s. I will survive, right? He says that's ignoble. It's ignoble to pride yourself as being a survivor alone. The question is not just to survive, it's to be virtuous. If you just survive, your life will become a life by which you judge things based on appearances, money, or reputation. After dealing with the soul At 7:28 to 7:30, he deals with the body. The worst thing you can do is live for money. He's not against having money. What he is against is live as having money being your highest desire. He says one of the worst signs of a father is a father who says, I'm going to work to make a lot of money to leave behind for my kids. Right?
You're allowed to be able to raise them.
It's different to raise your children. The thing is, you always got to be careful with money and comfort, because these things can always very easily cause disorders in your mental emotions. It's very easy to lie, basically, to yourself, and to think that you're not pursuing money when in fact you are. So if you're the father of a family, I would say a good sign that you're not pursuing money is that you're home to spend time with that you see your wife and children as your first job, and that you see whatever profession you have as your second job. And the only way you can really be a good father and husband, well, first a good husband and second a good father, is by spending good quality time, not watching TV, not reading the newspaper, with your wife and children. And again, we shouldn't just talk about following precepts. We should actually try to live virtue. Precepts are a means for helping us to live virtue. And ultimately also, we should respect the laws, right? Because the laws bring about order in society. And then from 7:30 to 7:32, he deals with the mixture of soul and body together in man. Ultimately, the human person should seek the truth. Someone who seeks the truth is trustworthy. Actually, this guy pointed out on his radio show as I was going up there, someone who fails to be, the sociologists have done these studies, someone who fails to seek the truth is much more likely to commit a violent crime, is much more likely to embezzle, is much more likely to commit harm against someone else. Basically, the fact of truth-seeking is sociologically good for the human person. If you're not a truth seeker, it's basically too easy at this point. If you give up on seeking the truth, it's too easy to rationalize lying. So you should always try to be a sincere truth seeker. The ideal person, as far as mixing together the body and soul, he basically says is someone who is both, he doesn't use these terms, but the phenomenon he's describing is someone who is both strong-willed and humble at the same time. The worst kind of characters, in this section also he slams Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Right, he says the worst kind of characters would be someone who knows what is evil and does it. And then the worst kind of education would be the kind of education where you basically say children should follow what their inclinations tell them to do. That's modern education in America. That's John Dewey and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The worst kind of knowledge is the kind of knowledge of a freshman or a sophomore, right? The argument from ignorance. Someone who says, because I don't know something, it can't be true, right? So if anyone ever argues that way, they are the biggest of fools, right? That's the weakest argument is the argument from ignorance, right? The weakest form of refutation. Because I don't know something, it can't be true. And then finally he says we should always be willing to rely on common sense as a guide. In section F, or from 732 to 734, this is the discussion on pleasure and pain. And the basic point here is that the final end we should be pursuing, we should pursue that end for its own sake. Joy will come with that end, but we shouldn't be pursuing that pleasure for itself. Aquinas will expand on this in the treatise on happiness. And then the final section for today's reading is 735 to 747. He starts to build the city. And the basic point here in this section is that the purpose of the city is unity. And after you get marriage and family right, the first thing you got to get right as far as the laws of marriage and family almost get right before you promulgate laws, if you remember. The first thing you've got to get right as far as promulgating laws is economic policy. And his basic point is that liberation theology is wrong and free market capitalism is wrong. The basic kind of political economy that you need for a stable society is some sort of proportional equality that allows for private property, but that also encourages citizens to make their money and their private property available for the common good. And that's basically the social doctrine of the church. You need to respect the right of private property, but also you need to make people aware of the grave, serious responsibility that they have to make their property available for the common good. And that's the point of that first section. You have to protect private property, you have to protect wealth, but at the same time, private property and wealth should be put at the disposal of the common good.
It's an individual decision.
Well, it can be encouraged, but ultimately it should be a decision based on virtue, yes.
So the state's not really supposed to be involved in legislating that too much?
Well, the state can help encourage it, but it can't force it.
So you can't legislate virtue.
Well, you can legislate the preconditions of virtue.
Virtue is always a choice, though. You can't.
It's ultimately a personal choice in the end.
Yeah.
Well, that's the problem.
So in other words, when you say you can't legislate virtue, that's not an is or an ought statement. That's a factual statement. No matter what legislation you create, it will not create virtue unless the citizens freely choose to live virtue.
It can create the preconditions of them being free to choose virtue,
Right.
right?
Yeah, so for example, it's perfectly just to make it very hard for a man to divorce his wife.
Ireland.
Huh?
Ireland.
Yeah. You're not legislating virtue. You're not forcing the guy to be virtuous. But you are setting up conditions that make it harder for him to act in unjust ways.
Well, and to act virtuously, right, you need to be free first. Like freedom actually, you have to be free.
Yeah, tyranny, it's very hard to be virtuous in a tyrannical society.
Yeah. So like this is what Thomas says, that virtue comes about by some training, an external training.
Right, but then again, remember the comparison he made between Egypt and Athens in the previous book? Egypt is complete limitation. Athens is complete freedom. Neither give you virtue. There can be some, in other words, the art of the statesman is the guy that knows what the truth is, and he knows what virtue is, and he knows what are the appropriate limitations to place on people that help encourage virtue. See you, Chris. He realizes that you can't have Egypt, and that you can't have the Netherlands either. There are limitations you can place, But you got to know what are the right limitations to place on society. Like maybe Paul Griffiths is right. Maybe only the church should regulate marriage. You know? I could say in some ways you could say, like in the U.S., this whole thing of our tax structure and how it encourages donations to private groups and whatnot, that could be something that's very good overall for the common good. Because it respects personal wealth. But then one question that's raised in here, which is I don't have an answer to it. Would it be just to limit the amount of wealth someone can make? I mean, I know. For example, Ben and Jerry are not exemplars. But when Ben and Jerry started the Ben and Jerry ice cream company, they made, this was not required by law, but they made the personal commitment that they would never make more than 10 times the amount of the lowest paid employee of their company.
It didn't the Delta CEO just gave his bonus to an employee fund or something.
He might have, yeah.
Yeah, no, I saw it on the USA Today. He just recently did that. He gave it was like several $1 million bonus or something to the employee.
Now, but again, those things are not enforced by law, but they are being done.
Yeah.
In the end, unions were things that were actually. It's interesting. Go ahead.
See, I feel like in some ways, like having the possibility of writing on off your taxes means that people are more likely, without pure motives, to give money to charity.
Yeah, no, that could be. It's interesting, though, for example, the unions, before the New Deal, unions were not really regulated by law. Right? They were allowed to exist because you have a right to assemble, but they were not regulated by law. It's the New Deal that really began to regulate them in a serious way. And in fact, Justice Sutherland, I like Justice Sutherland.
Is he Catholic?
I don't think he was Catholic. He might, I don't know if he was or not.
I just looked up to see who the Catholic justices were.
But Sutherland was great on union. Sutherland is one of these guys that I think was great. I think I don't know if he ever studied the natural law, but I think the natural law was lurking in the back of his mind. He basically said, in the famous union decisions during the New Deal, he basically said to the court and to the unions, he said, I don't think we should let the federal government protect unions. Why? If we let them protect unions today, they will destroy unions tomorrow. That was basically his argument. And I think he was very prescient. If he would have, because it's true that the New Deal protected unions and made them strong for a while, but it basically also made it possible for the federal government to destroy the unions in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. And I think also that's what made the unions kind of become corrupt. And this whole, the jokes about, well, I can't do that, I'm a union worker. All that stuff developed during the age when it was the federal government regulating the unions. So he basically said, in a lot of these union decisions, he basically said, well, just let the unions negotiate with the government or with the company. Make sure neither side does things that are violent against the other side. That you can do. But you should let them negotiate their own contracts. I think that's true. I think he also got the Commerce Clause right.
What do you say about the Commerce Clause?
Basically, the federal government shouldn't mess around in it.
So he wasn't in favor. What is it called? The negative Commerce Clause or whatever it is?
No. Basically, he also had one of the he died before the famous NLRB case.
Okay.
But there was a case right before that one where he wrote the majority opinion striking down the federal laws. Basically saying the same thing about commerce. If we let this law pass, Congress will regulate anything as commerce.
When was he on the bench?
The 30s, 20s and 30s.
What was his opinion on incorporation?
Shouldn't happen. Hadley Arcus wrote a book on Justice Sutherland. And Hadley Arcus is a natural law theorist, where you can use the 14th Amendment to incorporate the Bill of Rights.
So the due process clause of the 14th Amendment.
To take away a lot of things that states do traditionally and make the federal government do it.